There are times when a single phrase uttered on impulse has the power to destroy what you've spent years building. And if you observe carefully, you'll realize that men who sink don't fall because of grand gestures, but because of small words. The most dangerous enemy of authority is not weakness nor failure. It's the compulsive need to speak. A silent, almost instinctive need to fill the air with explanations, justifications, and opinions that no one asked for. And it is precisely at this point that the most shameful falls begin. Machiavelli already warned, those who talk too much reveal too much. Not only do they reveal their intentions, but also their fears, their uncertainties, and the hidden desperation for validation. And nothing threatens a leader's authority more than the perception of fragility. Have you ever noticed how the people who dominate a room are not those who speak the loudest, but those who speak the least, and yet everyone turns to listen to them? There's something almost enigmatic about this behavior. It's as if silence creates its own density, a gravitational force that attracts respect. But in today's world, where everyone is encouraged to have an opinion on everything, silence has become an act of rebellion, a sign of self-control, a calculated gesture. And that's precisely why talking too much has become a strategic risk. The more you expose yourself, the more predictable you become. The more predictable, the more vulnerable. An intelligent adversary doesn't need to take you down directly. They just need to observe your words, identify your emotional weaknesses, and use them against you. And the worst part is that often we reveal these weaknesses voluntarily. If you've ever found yourself talking to fix an image, or to avoid seeming indifferent, or to ensure no one misinterprets your intentions, then you know this trap. Excessive talking creates the illusion of protection, when in reality it opens doors that should remain closed. The truth is that every word is a concession, every explanation an invitation to be questioned, and every attempt to justify yourself an implicit confession of insecurity. What you say with the intention of defending yourself ends up becoming the instrument of your downfall. That's why great strategists never speak impulsively. They measure each syllable like someone calculating their next move on a chessboard. They know that silence awakens curiosity, and that curiosity, in turn, generates power. When you speak too little, people begin to imagine what you're thinking. When you speak too much, they stop imagining and start judging. The difference is brutal, and this is where the psychology of power shows its cruelest side. The human mind fears what it cannot decipher. Imagine for a moment someone who, after an accusation, remains impassive. They don't rebut. They don't justify themselves. They don't rush to appear innocent. This behavior is disconcerting because it deviates from the norm. It disarms because it's unpredictable. And it challenges because it suggests an inner strength that doesn't need to prove anything. The absence of a response creates an atmosphere of mystery, and mystery quickly becomes confused with authority. That which cannot be rid creates discomfort. That which cannot be anticipated creates respect. Conversely, consider someone who answers everything, comments on everything, discusses everything. Someone who cannot stand emptiness, who cannot tolerate silence, who feels an almost physical urge to explain their motives. This person may even seem active, communicative, transparent. But in Machiavelli's eyes, they have already lost before even beginning, because those who explain themselves too much diminish themselves. Those who try to prove their worth reveal that they still don't believe in themselves. And those who try to convince the world of their strength are, in fact, confessing their fragility. The irony is that the more you try to control your image through speech, the more you lose it. And the more you resist the temptation to speak, the more solid you become. It's a counterintuitive but infallible logic. True authority lies not in the volume of the voice, but in the weight of silence. Silence cuts. Silence unsettles. Silence affirms things that words cannot express. It is the signature of strategists, the refuge of the wise, and the nightmare of the impulsive. This is the terrain where power begins in the ability to contain what the majority cannot control. While others rush to react, you observe. While others try to justify their actions, you remain firm. While others try to explain themselves to avoid misunderstandings, you simply maintain your stance. And in this brutal contrast, the difference that separates the ordinary from the feared is born. You are about to enter a territory where every word costs something, and every silence gives something back. Where talking too much not only destroys your authority, but also surrenders your mind into the hands of others. And where learning to be silent is not submission, it's strategy. This is the first door, and if you cross it carefully, the next part will reveal why the modern world rewards those who control their own tongue and punishes those who try to fill every space with empty voices. Get ready. From here on out, silence ceases to be absence and becomes a weapon. If you observe human behavior without filters, you'll notice something curious. Almost no one speaks because they want to communicate. Most people speak because they need to alleviate an inner unease. It's as if silence were a relentless mirror, capable of revealing insecurities we prefer to hide. And that's precisely why so many people undo their own authority without realizing it, because they try to fill the silence before it reveals something they don't want to face. Machiavelli would understand this perfectly. He knew that man speaks less with his mouth and more with his fears, and that it only takes letting someone speak long enough to discover everything they tried to conceal. You've probably experienced this. A simple discussion that turned into chaos because someone didn't know when to stop. A message you sent quickly just to explain what you really meant that ended up creating even more confusion. Or those conversations where you find yourself trying to justify every detail as if your reputation depended on a perfect narrative that no one actually asked for. This is the silent mechanism that destroys the authority of the modern individual. It's not the conflict itself, but the desperate impulse to respond immediately, to defend yourself, to prove you're right. Consider a common situation. You receive unfair criticism. What do most people do? They immediately open their phones, type long paragraphs, send intense audio messages, and try to put everything in its place. But at the exact moment you react like that, something changes in the other person's perception. You cease to be the one controlling the narrative and become the one who needs to be understood. Authority disappears the second the need to explain yourself becomes visible. The criticism ceases to be the problem. Your reaction becomes the spectacle. Machiavelli would write about this dynamic with surgical precision. He would say that while you try to prove something, the other person merely observes. And observing in the game of power is far more dangerous than attacking. The observer gathers fragments, perceives patterns, identifies weak points. And when you talk too much, you not only expose what you feel, you expose what you fear. You expose where it hurts, You expose what you cannot control. And here enters an intriguing everyday phenomenon. The quiet person in the room always makes more of an impact than the most talkative one. They may not be the most intelligent, nor the most experienced, but their presence carries a tension that no one can ignore. You've seen this at work, in your family, among friends. There's always someone who speaks little, but when they do, everyone stops. Not because this person demands attention, but because they have achieved something more valuable: the weight of the contained word. Prolonged silence creates expectation, and expectation generates authority. Now compare that to the person who comments on everything, reacts to everything, and gives their opinion on everything. The more they talk, the less impact they have. Their words begin to lose substance, and their presence becomes perceived as background noise. It's cruel, but it's true. Abundance reduces value. This applies to gold, to time, and above all, to words. When everything is said, nothing matters. There is also the emotional dimension. Those who talk too much are usually not trying to communicate. They're trying to alleviate anxiety. They are the kind of person who cannot bear the weight of others' gaze and tries to fill it with explanations. But the more they explain, the deeper they sink. The attempt to clarify a situation turns into exposure, and exposure becomes vulnerability. What was defense becomes confession, and that's when the cycle closes. The more vulnerable you seem, the more people act as if they have the right to give their opinion about you. They feel authorized to judge, criticize, interfere, and all because you opened the door with too many words. Words in this context function as invitations. Each phrase you offer gives permission for someone to enter a little further into your mind, until, without realizing it, you no longer control your own narrative. But there's something even deeper, something few realize. Talking too much destroys not only your external image, but also your internal image. Every time you try to justify your existence to others, you send a silent message to yourself. My presence isn't enough. This kind of self-sabotage goes unnoticed in daily life, but it corrodes personal strength like rust. That's why, when we finally learn to be silent, something changes. Posture changes. Energy changes. Gaze changes. Silence ceases to be discomfort and becomes firm ground. You stop reacting and begin to observe. You stop defending yourself and begin to choose. Silence becomes freedom, and this transition doesn't happen in a grand way. It first appears in the simplest moments, when you decide not to respond to a provocation, when you read something unfair about yourself and simply close the screen, when you realize you don't need to explain your reasons to someone who isn't interested in understanding them. It is in these minimal gestures that the new authority is born, the kind that doesn't depend on the gaze of others to exist. But like all real power, this transformation comes at a price. By adopting strategic silence, you cease to be predictable, and that which is unpredictable always causes discomfort. People who previously criticized you now begin to observe from afar. Those who laughed begin to suspect that perhaps you are not as simple as they thought, and many will feel a subtle unease because they will realize they have lost access to your mind. It is at this point that the game changes completely. And in the next part, you'll see how this silent change reorganizes the entire force field around you, including within you. Because power isn't born when you speak. It's born precisely when you choose not to speak. The real turning point happens when you realize that silence isn't just a social strategy, but a lens that reveals the world in a different way. Something changes in how you observe people. Suddenly, every word spoken by others seems to carry more weight than before, not because they've become more intelligent, but because now you see what's behind each sentence. Excess, haste, anger, nervousness, all that which previously went unnoticed becomes legible. And at the same time, what you don't say begins to act in the environment as an invisible force. It's at this stage that many begin to feel a strange, almost silent power taking shape. It's not arrogance. It's awareness. Over time, you realize that silence is like a magnetic field. It attracts confessions, destabilizes impulses, reveals intentions. People who have never opened up begin to reveal too much. People who always seemed confident begin to stumble over their own words. It's as if your calmness becomes a mirror where others see themselves for the first time. And curiously, they don't like what they see. That's why they react. That's why they test. That's why they talk too much. It's an ancient dance between those who control their own energy and those who try to steal some of it for themselves. It is precisely at this point that the inevitable question arises. Why does silence bother others so much? Perhaps because it removes the comfortable ground of predictability. Perhaps because it forces the other person to listen to themselves while they speak. Or perhaps because silence dismantles the fantasy of control that many believe they have. The question is, what happens when you become the only person in the room who doesn't feel obligated to explain themselves? The answer is simple and unsettling. You become unpredictable. And unpredictability in the real world is pure power. It's as if suddenly social rules begin to revolve around you. People start measuring their words in your presence. They begin to choose more carefully what they say. They even try to guess what you're thinking and fail. The absence of explanation creates an empty space they can't bear, and in trying to fill it, they reveal more about themselves than you will ever reveal about yourself. This is where a new perception emerges. Silence is a radar. It identifies who is comfortable with themselves and who needs to attack in order not to crumble. It's fascinating to notice how some retreat, others become nervous, and some even try to provoke you, hoping you'll break your new code. But you don't break it. You observe, and in observing, you understand something essential. Those who most want you to say something are precisely those who most fear what you might say. Shouldn't this make you wonder what energy your presence awakens in others? Over time, you realize that social dynamics are less about dialogue and more about territory. Every word someone utters is an attempt to mark space, to position themselves, to test boundaries. And when you don't respond, you not only maintain your territory, you expand it. Silence becomes the inviolable boundary that no one crosses without permission. People who never respected your time begin to be wary. People who once spoke for you now hesitate. Something has changed, and it has changed profoundly. And it is precisely at this moment that an uncomfortable revelation emerges. Most people don't want to hear your voice. They want to hear your vulnerability. They don't want to understand your arguments. They want to dismantle your defenses. The insistence on asking for explanations was never about communication. It was about control. When you finally realize this, it's impossible to go back to being who you were. The social world changes color. It becomes clearer, more raw, more honest, and you begin to see the whole game, not just the moving pieces. Then another question arises. If explaining so much has always been a way of giving in, why do we insist on it? Perhaps because we were trained from childhood to believe that being understood is a form of security. But over time, you discover that security doesn't come from the approval of others. It comes from the ability to sustain one's own silence without trembling. It comes from the courage to be misunderstood. It comes from the understanding that those who need to explain too much are those who don't trust their own worth. And this is where the transformation reaches its peak. When you stop participating in battles you didn't choose. When you realize that most discussions are nothing more than invitations to waste energy. That most provocations are just neediness disguised as confrontation. And that the world is full of people demanding attention while pretending to ask for explanations. The day you begin to identify this is the day your authority is reborn silently and irreversibly. But there's one final question that needs to be asked. What changes within you when you realize you owe nothing to anyone but your own consistency? The answer appears slowly, like a beacon in the fog. You begin to breathe differently. Your posture changes without you even noticing. Your decisions become firmer, even the internal ones. And above all, you discover a truth that Machiavelli would hint at with a discreet smile. Whoever controls their words controls their destiny. And it is precisely this silent destiny that begins to take shape now as you move on to the next part, where power ceases to be a discovery and becomes practice, where silence ceases to be a defense and becomes strategy, and where authority finally ceases to be sought and begins to be built. And there are moments in life when a simple detail completely changes how we perceive human communication. And this shift usually happens when we witness something unexpected, something that disrupts common social logic. Imagine, for example, a real episode that occurred in a small European company. Widely discussed among behavioral specialists, an employee was accused, in front of everyone, of making a serious mistake, something capable of jeopardizing an entire project. Everyone awaited his response, expecting the desperate defense that always arises in these moments. But he said nothing. He simply listened, took a deep breath, and made a simple gesture. He closed his laptop and left the room. His silence at that moment changed the course of the meeting. The person who accused him began to stumble over their own words, trying to justify the attack. The team became confused, observing the growing discomfort. And in the end, it turned out that the mistake hadn't even been his. This event became a case study used by consultants to show how silence can disarm entire narratives without lifting a finger. What's surprising in this type of situation is realizing how the absence of a response can become more powerful than any well-constructed argument. It's almost counterintuitive. We grow up believing that we need to defend ourselves, explain, justify, constantly prove that we are right. But the real world works very differently. Often, simply not reacting is enough for the truth to emerge on its own. Most accusations stem from impulse, not logic, from insecurity, not observation. And when you don't fuel the impulse, the person reveals themselves. This phenomenon has even been observed in social psychology experiments. When participants received moderate verbal provocations and opted for absolute silence, the provocateurs reported increased anxiety, irritation, and a feeling of loss of control. Silence causes this because it breaks the symmetry of the conversation. It removes predictability. It exposes. Another curious account came from a university professor known for his extremely calm demeanor. During a class, he was confronted by a student who accused him of favoritism in front of the entire class. The professor remained motionless, looking at the student as if analyzing a natural phenomenon. The class awaited his response. He gave none. He simply wrote something down on a piece of paper, put it in his pocket, and continued the lesson. In the following minutes, the entire class began to look at the student with suspicion, and the student himself, realizing the reversal, stammered an attempt at an explanation, clearly embarrassed. He then apologized. The professor never mentioned the matter again. This case is studied today as an example of how silence alters the power hierarchy within a group without resorting to any confrontation. And here arises a question that few dare to face. If silence dismantles accusations so effectively, why can't most people use it? The answer is uncomfortable, because silence demands self-control. It demands deep, not theatrical, confidence. It demands a willingness to be misinterpreted in the short term in order to gain authority in the long term. Most people are afraid of this window of uncertainty, afraid of what others will think, afraid of what silence might imply. And because of this fear, they talk too much, give too much away, concede too much. Machiavelli already observed this pattern centuries ago. Those who fear appearing guilty become vulnerable. Those who accept the risk of appearing enigmatic become respected. There are also improbable stories that illustrate how silence shapes even seemingly unresolved conflicts. An experienced diplomat once recounted that during a tense negotiation between two countries, one side tried to provoke him with veiled insults. He didn't respond. He remained motionless, as if watching a storm that didn't reach him. The opposing negotiators began to raise their voices, expecting a reaction that never came. Minutes later, they realized they had completely lost their composure, while he remained unmoved. When they spoke too much, they exposed their strategic weaknesses. By the time they realized this, the dynamic was already set. He had won without needing to confront. This episode became a repeated lesson in diplomatic circles. Silence is the weapon of those who understand that impulsive speech is always a disguised confession. These events seem extraordinary, but they are not rare. You have probably witnessed something similar, even if you didn't realize it. Perhaps in a family argument where one person chose not to react. Perhaps in a work meeting where the quietest person was actually dictating the emotional temperature of the group. Or perhaps it happened to you, even unintentionally. Someone tried to provoke you. You didn't respond, and the other side became destabilized. It happens because silence does something that words cannot. It returns the weight of the accusation to the one who made it. It transforms the surrounding space, making visible what was previously hidden. And it is at this point that the most unexpected twist occurs. The more you observe these situations, the more you realize that it's not just about communication, but about energy. The energy you retain when you don't react. The energy the other person loses when they try to extract a response from you that doesn't come. It's as if there were a hidden mechanism governing human interactions, a kind of silent emotional economy. And those who understand this economy learn to survive the chaos without entering it. They learn to measure their words like they measure their ammunition. They learn to use silence as a shield, as a mirror, and when necessary, as a weapon. Silence, when used well, transforms into narrative. It shapes perceptions. It reorganizes alliances. It creates myths. And when you become aware of this process, you begin to perceive something unsettling. Perhaps the world is not moved by the people who speak the loudest, but by those who know exactly when not to speak. This is the point where the viewer finds themselves before a portal. The same portal crossed by strategists, by discreet leaders, by those who have already understood that speaking is easy, but silence is an art. And upon crossing this portal, you realize that true communication begins where the voice ends. From here, the narrative shifts in tone. We're no longer just talking about avoiding conflict or diffusing attacks. We're talking about building a position. It doesn't matter if it's at work, in relationships, in public or private life. Silent power begins to transform into presence. And presence is something that cannot be faked, only cultivated. It is this presence that will pave the way for the next part, where silence ceases to be merely reaction and becomes creation, the invisible foundation of true authority. As we move towards the nerve center of this reflection, it's inevitable to realize how silence, when mastered, begins to take on an almost physical form within human relationships. It begins to occupy space, impose presence, and shape behaviors around it. There's something profoundly strategic in this, something Machiavelli would certainly recognize. When a leader controls silence, he controls the emotional climate of the environment. This is no exaggeration. People's very breathing changes when they realize that their attention has become too precious to be distributed indiscriminately. It is at this point that silence ceases to be absence and transforms into a method. And it is precisely here that many err. They confuse speaking less with disappearing, when in fact strength lies in appearing only when necessary, never when weak or uncertain. That's why in everyday life, those who learn to regulate what they deliver, and especially what they withhold, gain an advantage that few realize: controlled predictability. People start to wonder what you're thinking, what you'll do, why you're quiet. And doubt, as we know, is a powerful engine. It creates tension, value, and expectation. And expectation, when well managed, creates authority. Now imagine the opposite. Someone who talks nonstop, who explains everything, who fills every void with anxious words. This person bares themselves to the world, reveals their movements, exposes their insecurities, and loses the element most feared by those who wish to manipulate: uncertainty. Those who are too predictable are controllable. Those who expose themselves too much are decipherable. And what is decipherable never frightens. But there's something more delicate happening in the background. When we talk too much, we create noise, and noise destroys what we try hardest to build: credibility. You've certainly witnessed scenes like this, someone trying to demonstrate knowledge but stumbling over their own arguments, repeating ideas, and taking detours that add nothing. The speech becomes self-sabotage. Excess reveals weakness. And worse, it damages the image of the person trying to prove something. Now ask yourself, how many times have you lost the impact of a good idea because you insisted on explaining it more than necessary? How many times have you reinforced what should have been left implied? It's at this boundary that excess transforms into poison. What few realize is that silence is not just an external choice, but an internal discipline. It requires self-control, the strength to accept that not every response needs to be immediate. Not every provocation deserves a reaction. Not every situation needs to be explained. Contrary to what many think, remaining silent is not retreating. It is waiting, it is observing, it is calculating. It is allowing the other person to reveal more than they would like, while you reveal less than you need to. And this is not just strategic, it is profoundly liberating. Because when you master your own impulse to fill voids, you begin to see where the voids in others are. And there's an even more intriguing detail. Silence creates spontaneous narratives. When you don't say something, people invent it. They fill in the gaps with interpretations, projections, fears, or desires. And incredibly, these projections are often more powerful than anything you could have said. Machiavelli knew that governing is not about controlling people directly, but about controlling what they imagine. And nothing fuels the human imagination like the calculated absence of explanations. The less you give, the more people build. And the more they build, the more you control without needing to touch. That's why the art of speaking little begins to become something bigger, an invisible mechanism of influence. When you master this mechanism, you realize you no longer need to compete for space with those who speak too loudly. You simply become the reference point others seek to confirm their own theories. What once seemed like passivity transforms into power. Silence now dictates the rhythm of the conversation, defines the limits of what is said, and establishes the moment when your voice will finally break expectations. And that moment, when it arrives, is always stronger than any uninterrupted speech. In the end, it all comes down to a transition, ceasing to be someone who talks and becoming someone who carries weight. Your words cease to be numerous and become valuable. Your presence ceases to be constant and becomes anticipated. Your opinion ceases to be commonplace and becomes decisive. And this transition changes everything: your relationships, your image, your opportunities. You don't speak less to hide something. You speak less so that when you do speak, the world stops to listen. And it is precisely this shift, this almost invisible change in posture, that prepares us to understand the final point of this journey. The final part, where we will explore what it truly means to use silence as an instrument of power, not just in discourse, but in the construction of one's own identity. We've reached the point where everything that's been said finally needs to find a place within you, not as theory, but as daily practice. From here on, silence ceases to be merely a seductive concept and transforms into a concrete tool, capable of changing not only how you communicate, but how you occupy the world. Because at its core, everything we've discussed so far isn't just about controlling words, but about recovering something many have lost: self-possession. In a time when everyone shouts, the true revolution is being able to listen first to others, then to the environment, and finally to oneself. This order matters. It's the foundation for everything you can build from now on. Imagine for a moment what your life would be like if you could master the art of not reacting immediately. How would your relationships, your conflicts, your decisions change? How many unnecessary arguments would be avoided? How many silent humiliations would cease to exist? How many opportunities would arise simply because you decided not to give everything away at once? Silence, when guided by awareness, creates a new light on situations. It illuminates hidden intentions, reveals manipulations that previously went unnoticed, exposes patterns you didn't perceive because you were too busy justifying, explaining, arguing. When you breathe before responding, you let the world reveal itself, and that's worth more than any clever phrase. But none of this works without courage. Silence isn't comfortable, especially when we've been trained to believe that speaking is the only way to exist. Silence demands strength to endure discomfort, to bear the doubt of others, to face the insecurity that arises when we realize we don't control everything. And perhaps that's the greatest revelation of this journey. Silence isn't the absence of control, it's emotional mastery. It's the ability to resist impulses and transform each pause into a strategy. It's not about hiding, but about positioning yourself so solidly that words cease to be your shield. They become your arrow, and arrows aren't launched at every moment, they're launched at the exact right time. This is where Machiavelli returns as a lucid shadow over everything we've discussed. He knew that a strong prince is not one who speaks much, but one whose presence weighs more than any speech. He understood that authority is not built on volume, but on precision. Silence, for him, was as much a political as it was a military resource, as much a psychological as it was a diplomatic one. And that's precisely what you can apply now in your daily life, without needing to govern a state, because you govern something greater, yourself. And whoever governs themselves is never governed by the noises of the world. Now think about the coming days, not the grand plans, but the small interactions. Try choosing a moment when you would normally speak out of anxiety and voluntarily decide not to speak. Just observe. See how people react, how the environment rearranges itself, how you feel more present. Gradually, this gesture begins to create a new kind of confidence. The confidence that you don't need to rush to be relevant. You begin to realize that silence doesn't diminish your importance. It amplifies it. It rearranges the balance of the conversation. It makes your words, when they finally arrive, come with weight, direction, and intention. And perhaps the most beautiful and most transformative part of all this is realizing that silence serves not only to strengthen your outward authority, but also to reveal your inner truth. When you stop filling in the noise, you begin to hear your own thoughts clearly. Anxiety diminishes. Self-criticism loses intensity. Internal tensions slow down. You identify what truly matters and what was merely creating noise within you. This change doesn't happen overnight, but begins with the first conscious act of silence, not out of fear, but by choice. And conscious choices, however small, are what build lasting power. That's why silence should never be seen as escape. It is preparation. It is calculation. It is refined presence. It is the moment before the blow, the instant before the decisive speech, the space in which your mind sharpens while the world believes you are standing still. And ultimately, that's what differentiates those who live at the mercy of external stimuli from those who conduct their own narrative. Those who master silence write their own story in a firm, lucid, and strategic way. And that's something no one can take away from you. If this journey made sense, if it awakened something in you, be it restlessness, clarity, or reflection, then my work here was worthwhile. Now I ask you for something simple, but essential so that we can continue creating transformative content. Leave a like, share this video, and comment, even anonymously. Say what you think, say how it touched you, or just leave a symbol, a small gesture that shows you were here. And of course, subscribe to the channel. Your presence strengthens this space and allows us to continue exploring thought with depth and courage. Thank you for reading to the end. From now on, the silence is in your hands.